Hello everyone and welcome back. This video is different than the one I promised during the last video because I was preparing for the thermistor uncertainty video, and I realized that I needed to go over some more kind of details about tolerances and manufacturing variation before we could really get into doing the thermistor analysis. And I wanted to do this because of two things. One, when you're doing an uncertainty analysis, it's easy to look at large numbers and say, oh my goodness, this is a terrible thermistor, even when you're looking at the worst case of a bunch of different tolerances stacked up. Conversely, it's also easy to say, okay, well, everything's going to average out in the end and it's going to all be fine, not realizing that the nominal isn't always the average value of a component. So today we're going to go over kind of just general manufacturing variation and look at how these things impact our day-to-day lives. For starters, let's look at this really basic problem that almost looks like something that would be in a middle school textbook, but bear with me. You have rectangular bars that are 100 millimeters long. How many bars fit in a space that is 400 millimeters wide? And as basic as this problem is, the answer of course is 4, because 400 divided by 4 equals 100 millimeters. But is that what happens in reality? Because in reality, no bar is exactly 100 millimeters long, and no space is exactly 400 millimeters wide. There's always a tolerance associated with basic dimensions that we use on a day-to-day basis. Pretty much anything varies, and so we need to account for that when we're not only designing the parts, but also when we're manufacturing the parts. In this case, you see our 100 millimeter bars are actually maybe 105 millimeters wide, and so as you stack them up together, they end up being significantly wider than the 400 millimeter space. Conversely, if they were 95 millimeters, there would be way too much free space at the end, and maybe if this design is intended to constrain those bars correctly, they would be sliding around, and that may cause other issues. So in this case, you want to design some sort of tolerance or fixturing so that even if your bars are not exactly the perfect dimension, that everything would still fit together properly. Let's take this bar analogy a step further. Let's say that I just want to start selling bars. They're going to be 100 millimeters long. I'm just working out of my garage. I have a circular saw, a tape measure, and I'm just going to start producing these and selling them. Just to measure quality, I'm going to measure these, so every sample I cut, I'm going to measure the length. And I'm going to plot them on this plot here, where essentially the y-axis is the percentage of samples that are a certain length, and then this, of course, is the length of the actual bar. So I'm going to measure my first sample, and it's pretty close. It's just over 100 millimeters, so we're good to go. Then I'm going to, here's with 10 samples. It's pretty spread out, but it's not too bad. You're plus minus 2 millimeters. Nobody will care. Going to 100 samples, and there's some outliers there, but it's not too bad yet. So, you'll start seeing, though, that the shape of this is starting to kind of have a hump in the center and kind of go out to the edges. There's some outliers, but they're mainly grouped right around the average here. And let's just say I keep going until I have 1,000 samples measured. And this shape keeps kind of getting further defined. We have, again, outliers are on the side, but most of it's in the center. This distribution is called a normal distribution. And it's really a common distribution of kind of data points when you just have natural variation. And again, not all processes can be approximated by a normal distribution, but in this case, we're going to assume we can. And if we plot that normal distribution, we'll see that these data points are starting to converge on this distribution. And what's so powerful about this is that if we have enough samples, we can characterize not only what our average value is, but also how much variation there is in our data set. So those two values are the average and standard deviation. And what's cool here is we can quantify, once we know the normal distribution in those two values, how many parts will be out of spec. So in this case, for instance, say we have a spec where we want to hit 100 millimeters plus or minus 2 millimeters. And in this case, from our 1,000 samples, if you actually measured that, it would be roughly 22 of our samples are above the tolerance and 17 are below, just from the random generation that we have here. That's very similar to the predicted values from the normal distribution. In order to get more of those in spec, because 4% of total components may be too much, we can improve our setup so that, say, we have better fixturing. Maybe I can slide the bar down to a hard stop and chop it to get a more consistent result. And that will reduce our variation, reduce our standard deviation. Let's say we divide it by 2. And you see the grouping of those values gets closer. And now in our sample size here, we actually have none of those 1,000 samples that are outside of our tolerance. So that's great. What I've done here is I've removed the randomly generated samples because we're going to assume that moving forward, if we measured an infinite number of samples, our data would be normally distributed. I've also added some data over here on the side, which is showing our nominals and tolerances, and also our average and standard deviation that defines this normally distributed function. As well, I've added these two parameters, which is how many of our samples will be out of tolerance on the high end, so greater than 102%, and then also the values that will be less than 98%. So up until now, we've assumed that all of our data is centered at the nominal value. So whenever we measure our parts, they're always going to average out to 100 millimeters. This assumption really isn't true because when you start measuring parts, you're never going to get spot on 100 millimeters. Your fixturing or stuff like that may end up putting you slightly over or under. So we're going to assume that our average is actually not exactly 100, but is 101. And you'll see this shifts our curve over to the right, and now we actually have a 2.28% of our sample data set that will be above tolerance. And you may be thinking, well, 2.28% doesn't sound that bad. But you have to remember that this is only one component that may go into an assembly of many parts. Let's just assume that the assembly, instead of just having one part, has 10 of these. And if the assembly, if any of these are out of spec, that the assembly will not be, functional. And all of a sudden, our failure rate has gone from 2.28% to over 20%. And 10 parts is really a low number. A common assembly is going to have hundreds, if not thousands or more components. And so this is really where it's important to stay within tolerance and make sure that your process is capable. Hopefully, manufacturers of components have a very tightly controlled process that even if their average is not the same as the nominal value, they have plenty of extra margin to the tolerances. For instance, in this case, instead of having a standard deviation of 0.5 millimeter, let's assume our process has a standard deviation of 0.2. Maybe we have some sort of CNC controlled machine with end stops and very tightly controlled, a rigid structure, so we don't have to worry about this. And in this case, even if the nominal is not at, or if the average is not the nominal, we're still well within our tolerances of 98 to 102. And even if the average is, even at, say, 101.5, we're still looking fairly good with only a small percentage of parts that are going to be out of spec. So this gives us a wide range, all the way from 101, say, down to 98.5, and everything is still going to be in spec. So that gives them a lot of flexibility. This flexibility is really critical when you have a process that is not as easy to adjust as, say, adjusting the end stop for, cutting a length of extrusion. Some processes are so complex that it takes, days or hours for a system to shut down and adjust a parameter, and then start back up, produce more parts, measure them, shut it down. That process can go on for quite some time, and that time is lost revenue. And so in those companies or businesses that have those types of products, this tight process control means that as soon as they hit the range of tolerances that they need, they're going to start producing parts because they're confident that they can hit the tolerances even if the kind of average value is not the nominal. So having gone through all that information, what does that really mean for us? Say we're building a 3D printer or we're looking at thermistor accuracy or extrusion lengths or things like that. What it means is that we need to understand that every component has a variable. It's not going to be the nominal length necessarily, and there are ways to get around kind of the natural variation. Like for instance, Misumi has a tolerance, I believe, of plus or minus half a millimeter on their extrusion lengths. This could be a big issue, but since they cut all of the same length extrusions at the same time with the same cut, they all end up being the same length. Even if they aren't exactly, say, the 300 millimeters you specified, they're all the same length. So as you build your frame, it's still going to end up square. If instead they cut each extrusion independently, there would be a lot more chance of your frame not ending up square. So that's kind of one of those things that they're accounting for that, so it's nice. We don't really have to think about it. For other parameters like thermistors or resistance values, you just have to expect that there is going to be some variation, and it's really hard to quantify that unless you go out and grab a bunch of resistors and measure them. And really, it's not useful to do that because again, a batch that we measure today may be different average-wise or standard deviation-wise than a batch that's produced tomorrow. Just based on those process parameters and how they were running or producing the line. So we just have to understand that hopefully all parts we get are going to be within tolerance, and there is some variation there, throughout that tolerance. Hopefully it's going to be centered around the nominal, and so we can assume most of the time, it'll likely be closer to the nominal. But there's going to be some times where it's close to those tolerances. And sometimes those tolerances will stack up. It may be rare that you get the worst case in all of the different components, but there's still a chance of it happening. So this next video again will be about thermistor tolerances and thermistor accuracy. And some of those numbers again are going to be fairly big. In some cases, we may see up to 20 or 30 degrees, plus or minus 20 or 30 degrees, as the total kind of tolerance stack up. And that seems really bad, but again, after what we've learned today, that's probably not going to be the case all the time, but it's really hard to quantify that. So I hope you learned something today. This was something that was really interesting for me as I went through standard elementary, middle, high school, and even in college. You're always assuming kind of these textbook problems where there's one correct answer and you solve it and move on. But once you get into the real world, there's so many more variables that you need to consider and account for, especially once you start mass producing things. So until next time, have a good one.